Beneath the crowns and crimson robes lies a kingdom of secrets, stranger than fiction and far more embroidered. Royal armor with oversized codpieces, queens who wore wigs to the grave, kings who spoke to trees and dined with leopards. These aren't legends, they're official record. Welcome to the bizarre, the baffling, and the brilliantly British world of monarchs behaving very, very oddly. Because when you rule an empire, reality doesn't have to make sense. It just has to wear a crown. Before we dive headfirst into royal oddities, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because trust me, it only gets weirder from here. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? I want to know who else is up late unraveling the monarchy with me. 1. King Henry VIII's armor had a codpiece so big it needed its own support. Some monarchs wear crowns to show their power. King Henry VIII? He preferred a different crown jewel. In 1540, a new suit of armor was commissioned for the king. It gleamed with gilded steel, sculpted breastplates and elbow guards that could double as soup ladles. But there was one piece that stood out, literally. The codpiece. It jutted out with such cartoonish confidence that historians still argue whether it was armor or architectural statement. Crafted like a miniature battering ram, it had to be structurally reinforced to avoid tipping the king over when he moved. Now, medieval armor wasn't exactly subtle. But Henry's codpiece went above and beyond medieval expectations and right into male ego mythos. It wasn't for protection, it wasn't practical, it wasn't aerodynamic. It was there to make a point, one that wagged with every step. At the time, codpieces were already fashionable among noblemen, a bizarre blend of masculinity and medieval fashion faux pas. But Henry's was on another level. It wasn't just padded, it was sculpted, raised, etched, embossed, as if the blacksmith had been commissioned to craft not just armor, but a legacy of testosterone. And make no mistake, Henry saw his body as divine. His fertility was political. His virility was propaganda. And if it required 10 pounds of wrought iron to prove it, so be it. You can still visit the armor today, housed in the Tower of London, where it stands like an absurd relic of insecure masculinity. It raises more questions than answers. Was he compensating? Was it meant to intimidate? Or was he just having a laugh? But don't worry. If you thought Henry's codpiece was excessive, wait until you meet a queen so committed to her image, she wore her face to the grave, literally. 2. Queen Elizabeth I refused to be seen without her makeup. Even on her deathbed, when Elizabeth I ruled England, her face became an icon. Pale, porcelain, perfect, or so the portraits claimed. In reality, the Queen's infamous mask of youth was a chemical nightmare. Her signature look came from white lead makeup, a substance so toxic it could slowly rot your skin. But Elizabeth didn't just wear it for glam. She wore it like armor, like denial, like a powdered proclamation that time, disease, and decay would never dare touch her royal cheekbones. Even as her hair thinned and her teeth blackened, she insisted on the illusion. She refused mirrors. She dismissed truth. She applied layer upon layer of the lead-based paste, so thick it reportedly cracked when she smiled, though smiling wasn't exactly her brand. And toward the end of her life, the mask became mandatory. Servants were forbidden to enter her chambers without warning, lest they see the Queen in her natural mortal state. According to legend, when Elizabeth was on her deathbed, she still refused to let the illusion drop. She lay still, perfectly composed, in full regalia, her powdered face untouched, a crimson wig in place, lips painted with vermilion. Her courtiers whispered that she didn't want to die, because death would mean being seen without her mask. But the true punchline? The very makeup that preserved her image may have hastened her end. Lead poisoning can cause fatigue, memory loss, and mood swings, all things Elizabeth battled in her later years. In her quest to remain timeless, she may have shortened the time she had. Still, there's something hauntingly poetic about it. A queen who became a myth by refusing to be real. But if Elizabeth ruled by illusion, her successor preferred spectacle, and his idea of a royal pet was just a bit more toothy. And if you're still with us after that royal makeover gone wrong, you clearly appreciate a good historical face palm. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button for more stories that make history feel like a fever dream. While you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it on your end? Middle of the night? Lunch break? I'm curious who else is wandering the royal rabbit hole with me. 3. King Charles II kept a pet leopard that roamed the palace. Every king has his quirks. Charles II had many, but none quite as jaw-dropping as his personal zoo. The Merry Monarch, as he was called, didn't just bring laughter back to England after the somber Puritan era. He also brought chaos, flamboyance, and a leopard, a real one. Spots, fangs, unpredictable temperament, and all. The story goes that the leopard was a diplomatic gift, one of many exotic animals sent to curry favor with the crown. But instead of sending it to a zoo, because those didn't quite exist yet, Charles let it live at Whitehall Palace. At first, it was confined to the Royal Menagerie, a petting zoo for the overly rich and terminally bored. But it didn't stay confined. On more than one occasion, the big cat got loose, prowling the gardens, terrifying servants, and possibly snacking on the occasional noble's lapdog. Charles, ever the showman, found it hilarious. Visitors described the palace grounds as lively, a word that here means somewhere between animal sanctuary and royal death trap. And Charles, he adored it. He would watch the leopard as he sipped wine, pet his spaniels, and flirt with mistresses, business as usual. To Charles, the leopard wasn't just a pet. It was an extension of himself, wild, unpredictable, flashy, dangerous when cornered. It represented everything he wanted his court to be, untamed, dazzling, slightly terrifying. And if someone happened to get mauled in the process, well, court life was never meant to be safe. Eventually, the leopard vanished from records, likely sold, gifted again, or buried in the palace garden under suspicious circumstances. But the legend lingered, another page in the royal scrapbook of questionable decisions. And speaking of questionable, the next monarch once mistook a tree for royalty and tried to shake its hand. 4. King George III tried to shake hands with a tree. The line between monarchy and madness has always been a thin, wobbly one. In the case of King George III, it was as flimsy as a leaf. The story goes like this. During one of his well-documented mental episodes, King George III was seen approaching a large oak tree in the gardens of Kew. He greeted it warmly, bowed slightly, and extended his hand. Why? Because he believed it was the King of Prussia. Not metaphorically, literally. Now, to be fair, trees have better listening skills than most courtiers. But this wasn't George engaging in quirky small talk. He was convinced, entirely, sincerely, majestically convinced that bark and branches equaled Prussian nobility. He chatted with it for some time, politely, of course. George was never rude, even when profoundly unwell. It wasn't an isolated incident either. George's mental health was fragile and, in the 18th century, fragile meant poorly understood and frequently misdiagnosed. Some blamed stress. Others blamed porphyria, a blood disorder. Others, his political enemies, blamed divine punishment for poor policies. The truth remains unclear. But the stories? They remain vivid. He once talked for hours without stopping, claimed he could hear angels in his soup, believed he had personally caused the changing of the seasons. It was like watching Shakespeare rewritten by Lewis Carroll. And yet, despite it all, George III was deeply loved. Farmer George, they called him, for his plain tastes and dedication to agriculture. A king who shook hands with trees, yes, but also one who read his Bible nightly and doted on his daughters. The contradiction was unsettling. He was both a ruler and a riddle, a monarch who wanted peace and a man who couldn't find it in his own mind. Still, if George thought an oak tree was royalty, at least he didn't collect locks of hair from a dead enemy. That honor belongs to someone else entirely. 5. Queen Victoria had a lock of Napoleon's hair. Queen Victoria was a woman of strong opinions, stronger emotions, and, in this case, odd souvenirs. Among her many private possessions was a tiny, curious keepsake, a lock of Napoleon Bonaparte's hair, snipped posthumously from the scalp of the former Emperor of France, wrapped in silk, and stored in a little box. A quiet trophy of a man who had never directly crossed her, but had haunted the British imagination like a national nightmare. Why did she have it? Simple answer: fascination. Longer answer: it was Victorian weirdness at its peak. The 19th century had a thing for collecting relics of the famous, infamous, or dearly departed. Locks of hair were particularly trendy, like celebrity autographs, but with DNA. Victoria, for all her public stiffness, was a deeply sentimental person. She kept Prince Albert's dressing gown for years after his death. She slept with his clothes. She wrote letters to him. So it wasn't entirely out of character that she'd treasure a strand of hair from one of history's most compelling villains. The fact that Napoleon had tried, and failed, to conquer England only added to the mystique. She reportedly kept it in her private chambers, not far from family portraits and treasured mementos. There's no evidence she stared at it longingly while plotting imperial expansion, but you never know. This was a woman who once declared, "We are not amused," while secretly collecting seashells and having her teeth brushed by her daughters. Napoleon, for his part, probably wouldn't have minded. He craved legacy more than land. He wanted to live forever, in any form. A statue, a song, or, sure, an English queen's drawer. But Victoria's morbid curiosities didn't end there. The next king in our parade of oddities didn't collect hair. He collected heretics, witches, and demons. 6. King James VI of Scotland, later James III of England, hated witches so much he wrote a book about them. Before he was the King of England, James VI ruled Scotland and spent a lot of that time very, very afraid of witches. Not just vaguely suspicious. Obsessively, sleeplessly terrified. In fact, in 1597, he wrote an entire book about them. Demonology, a royal how-to manual on detecting, exposing, and exterminating supernatural evil. Because why govern when you can ghost hunt with government funding? James believed witches were conspiring against him personally. And it wasn't paranoia if the thunderstorm on your honeymoon really seemed like a hex. He was convinced dark forces tried to sink his ship as he returned from Denmark, where coincidentally the witch panic was also in full swing. Clearly it was an international conspiracy, and James was its chosen target. So he took matters into his own inkwell. Demonology laid out the rules. How to spot a witch, how to interrogate her, always her, of course, and how to ensure she didn't cast spells with her dying breath. It even inspired one William Shakespeare to include 3 prophetic hags in Macbeth, a royal-approved cameo of James's personal demons. The king's obsession with witchcraft wasn't just personal, it was policy. Under his rule, witch trials surged. Executions mounted, fear spread, neighbor turned on neighbor. Women, mostly women, were accused, tortured, and killed for imagined offenses like spoiling milk or giving side-eye to a cow. To James, this was not cruelty. It was Christian duty. He saw himself as a divine warrior defending the realm from Satan's minions. But centuries later, his legacy reads like a cautionary tale. How fear can masquerade as faith, and how kings can turn superstition into statecraft. Still, for all his pious fire and brimstone, the crown would soon pass to someone far more indulgent. A queen who didn't burn witches, but brandy and occasionally her own furniture. 7. Queen Anne drank so much brandy. her furniture collapsed under her. If monarchy is about maintaining dignity, Queen Anne missed the memo, probably because someone spilled brandy on it. By the end of her reign, Queen Anne had become a symbol of excess, not in diamonds or drama, but in sheer physical mass. She suffered from a mix of medical conditions, gout, dropsy, and other 18th century ailments with names that sound more like pub trivia than diagnoses. But all of it was made considerably worse by one persistent royal habit: drinking. Anne adored her brandy, morning, noon, and night. It was the closest thing to therapy available to a woman who'd endured 17 lost pregnancies, constant political upheaval, and a court that judged her more for her shoes than her suffering. So she drank, and, well, eventually, the furniture started breaking. Literally. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe how her specially reinforced chairs would occasionally give way beneath her. Thrones, stools, carriages, they cracked and buckled under royal pressure. Craftsmen were reportedly commissioned to build sturdier seating from imported hardwoods and custom-forged iron. And even those didn't always hold. But Anne, to her credit, didn't much care. She rarely traveled, refused public appearances later in life, and spent much of her time playing cards with her ladies-in-waiting while downing another glass of medicinal brandy. She preferred comfort over courtly expectations, which, in its own subversive way, was kind of revolutionary. Despite her collapsing chairs and swollen limbs, Anne was more than just her caricature. She was clever, stubborn, and instrumental in the formation of the United Kingdom as we know it. But history, ever the tabloid, remembers the brandy and the broken seats. And speaking of indulgence, her successor didn't wait for the throne to begin his reign of excess. He started with custom furniture of a very different kind. 8. King Edward VII had a custom-built love seat for romantic meetings. Before Edward VII ever sat on the throne of England, he was far more interested in other seating arrangements. As Prince of Wales, Edward was known for many things: extravagant meals, mountain-sized cigars, and a social calendar that would exhaust a cruise director. But perhaps the most eyebrow-raising fixture of his personal life was the custom-built love seat he commissioned in Paris. A peculiar piece of furniture, designed not for rest, but for rendezvous. The chair, built by a famous French furniture maker named Sobre, featured a unique shape: 2 seats angled for intimacy, with strategically placed armrests, sturdy upholstery, and enough reinforcements to suggest the prince wasn't just using it for conversation. It was dubbed Le Siège d'Amour, the seat of love. Edward was a frequent visitor to the famed Parisian brothel Le Chabanais, where the chair resided. And yes, the staff kept it polished. The chair became so legendary that it outlived the prince's many affairs, eventually becoming a curiosity in museum collections. Back in England, Edward's romantic escapades were an open secret. The British public, ever proper, pretended not to notice. His mother, Queen Victoria, was less amused. She reportedly called him utterly disappointing and blamed him for her husband's early death from worry. But Edward didn't slow down, not in France, not in London, and certainly not in furniture design. The love seat remains a bizarre royal artifact, a symbol of Victorian hypocrisy, Franco-British irony, and one man's refusal to separate pleasure from craftsmanship. And while Edward's passions were very much alive, his great-great-niece would later be equally passionate about breakfast. Though her message to the palace kitchen was as polite as it was chilling. 9. Queen Elizabeth II sent a witty note to her kitchen about a dead mouse. Some monarchs rule with a scepter. Queen Elizabeth II ruled with post-it notes, and a particular flair for deadpan humor. One morning, somewhere inside the polished and protocol-obsessed walls of Buckingham Palace, Her Majesty sat down to breakfast. The usual, perhaps some toast, maybe some cereal, a splash of Earl Grey, and the weight of the British Empire. But this morning had a little extra crunch, courtesy of a dead mouse discovered in her cereal bowl. most of us would scream, or faint, or vow vengeance. Queen Elizabeth II simply wrote a note. Placing the small rodent on a saucer like a bizarre hors d'oeuvre, she calmly penned, "I found this in my breakfast. Could you please look into it?" That was the whole message. It was vintage Elizabeth, dry, restrained, and devastatingly British. No yelling, no scandal, just gentle disappointment expressed through handwritten stationery. Palace staff reportedly treated the incident with the gravity of a state emergency. Kitchens were inspected. Pest control was summoned. Entire cereal shipments were questioned. But the Queen, she went on with her day. Perhaps she even found it amusing. After all, she once joked that she had to be seen to be believed, and nothing says still mortal like a rodent in your Rice Krispies. Her quiet reaction became legendary among staff. It was a reminder that beneath the tiaras and centuries of ritual was a woman who didn't panic, even when nature joined her for breakfast. But if Elizabeth was unshakable in the face of mice, she descended from a monarch who was unshakable in his devotion to his own hair. 10. King Charles I had the longest hair ever seen on a British monarch. In the great royal tradition of vanity, Charles I didn't just have standards. He had an entire aesthetic doctrine, and it began at the scalp. The man was devoted to his hair. Portraits show him with flowing curls, styled meticulously, draping over his lace collars like a model from a Jacobean shampoo ad. Even in an era where long hair on men was fashionable, Charles took things a few inches further, quite literally. His locks reached his shoulders and beyond, a silken waterfall of political theater. It wasn't just vanity. Charles believed kings were chosen by God. That belief extended not just to his crown, but to every follicle beneath it. His hair wasn't hair. It was a divine accessory, a visual halo. And even when imprisoned during the English Civil War, Charles insisted his royal barber be allowed to visit. The war was falling apart. His kingdom was in flames, but heaven forbid anyone touch his bangs without permission. After his execution in 1649, yes, the ultimate bad hair day, royalist followers scrambled to collect relics. Among the most prized, strands of his hair, preserved in lockets, sewn into mourning clothes, or hidden in family Bibles. It was macabre, yes, but also telling. His hair had become a symbol, not of power, not even of loss, but of myth. Centuries later, museums still display these delicate wisps of kingly keratin, framed like sacred art. Each strand a ghost of a ruler who believed beauty, power, and sanctity could coexist in a single curl. And while Charles clung to the elegance of his appearance, the next monarch would do something far less elegant to maintain his own, squeeze into corsets so tight even his pride had to hold its breath. 11. King George IV wore corsets to hide his obesity. If you judged King George IV by his portraits, you might think he was statuesque, a finely built man with aristocratic posture and a tasteful waistline. Reality, however, had other ideas, namely, that he was nearly 300 pounds, couldn't walk upstairs without help, and wore corsets tighter than the truth. George IV was obsessed with his appearance. Even as his waist expanded, he insisted on being painted as a Greco-Roman hero. All jawline, zero jiggle. To achieve the illusion, he wore specially tailored clothing with heavy padding in the shoulders and tight boning at the waist. Think Regency-era shapewear, except this wasn't about slimming down for an event. This was daily life. His corsets were reinforced with whalebone and steel. Tailors had to be both surgeons and sculptors. Servants reportedly spent hours lacing him in, often having to pause so the king could catch his breath between heaves. And even then, the final result was optimistic. But vanity wasn't George's only vice. He loved rich food, brandy by the bottle, and extravagant furniture covered in pink velvet. We'll get to that. He styled himself as the first gentleman of England, which was less about manners and more about monocles, frilly shirts, and the finest trousers France could offer. Even foreign dignitaries commented on his appearance, some with amusement, others with barely disguised horror. One French ambassador compared him to a soufflé in silk. Yet George never stopped trying to preserve the illusion. To him, the image was the monarchy. But images only go so far. Unlike the next royal, who, in the final minutes of her life, revealed a loyalty so strange and intimate it emerged trembling from beneath her very dress. 12. Mary, Queen of Scots, kept a little dog, hidden in her dress. During her execution history, remembers Mary, Queen of Scots, as tragic, romantic, political, but rarely does it mention that, in the final moments of her life, she was also hiding a dog. A tiny terrier, to be exact, pale-colored, trembling, and fiercely devoted. The story goes that as Mary mounted the scaffold in 1587, she wore layers of ceremonial clothing, a black gown over a crimson petticoat, symbols of martyrdom and Catholic resolve. What no one expected was the little creature nestled within. Concealed beneath her skirts, the dog remained silent until the end. As Mary's life was taken, the terrier leapt out, refusing to be parted from its mistress. It reportedly whined, pawed at her body, and curled itself in the folds of her blood-stained clothing. No one had seen it enter. No one could bear to remove it. Even the executioners, hardened and practical men, were said to be moved. One account describes them hesitating, unsure what to do with a creature too loyal for comprehension. Eventually, the dog was taken away, washed, though it resisted fiercely, and given to a noblewoman sympathetic to Mary's cause. Some called it dramatic, others poetic, but the symbolism was eerie. The dog had followed her to the end, quietly bearing witness to a moment designed to erase her. It didn't beg for scraps. It didn't seek comfort. It simply stayed. In a world where monarchs built statues of themselves, Mary left behind something far more human, the undying loyalty of something small and voiceless. But if Mary was remembered for quiet devotion, the next monarch nearly lost his job for being too devoted, to prayer, to scripture, and to everything except actually governing. 13. King Henry VI was so pious, he forgot to rule. In a kingdom constantly teetering between war and diplomacy, King Henry VI made one thing very clear. He was not here for politics, or decision-making, or really any of the usual tasks associated with being a monarch. No, Henry was more interested in scripture than strategy. And while other kings built empires, Henry built a library of devotional texts and a very intense prayer schedule. To say he was devout is an understatement. Henry VI lived like a monk with a crown. He fasted obsessively, held long daily prayers, and was known to quote entire passages of the Bible mid-conversation, whether or not the conversation had anything to do with theology. When advisors came to him with matters of state, wars, taxes, rebellions, Henry often responded with a soft-spoken sermon and then quietly excused himself to meditate on the Psalms. Once, during a tense political negotiation, Henry simply wandered off, vanished from the meeting entirely. He was later found in a chapel, praying in silence. No one dared interrupt. It became a running issue. Urgent crises were regularly paused so the king could engage in quiet reflection. This would have been sweet if he were a monk. But Henry was a king, one embroiled in the 100 Years' War, dealing with ambitious nobles and governing a fractious country. His inattention didn't just annoy his advisors, it destabilized his rule. His passivity opened the floodgates for the Wars of the Roses. When nobles started declaring themselves king in his place, Henry responded by praying harder. To some, he was a saint. To others, a symbol of everything wrong with divine monarchy. Either way, Henry VI proved that holiness does not necessarily make for effective governance. And if you thought his detachment was odd, Wait until you meet a queen whose parrot repeated things that would make a sailor blush. 14. Queen Victoria's parrot cursed like a sailor. Queen Victoria was many things, stoic, disciplined, and about as emotionally expressive as a marble bust. But behind the stiff collars and royal decrees was a surprising fondness for animals. Dogs, horses, even Highland cows earned her affection. But none, perhaps, were quite as memorable as Coco, the African gray parrot with the mouth of a Navy veteran. Coco was gifted to Victoria during the height of the British Empire, when exotic pets were fashionable among the aristocracy. Intelligent and highly verbal, the bird quickly adapted to palace life, learning to mimic phrases with unnerving accuracy. Unfortunately, many of those phrases were learned from soldiers stationed nearby. The result? A parrot with the uncanny ability to swear fluently in several dialects. Coco's outbursts reportedly startled diplomats, amused courtiers, and once caused a bishop to turn visibly red during an afternoon visit. The bird had excellent timing, often squawking obscenities during uncomfortable silences or when someone dropped a teacup. Victoria, rather than being scandalized, is said to have laughed, privately of course. In public, she maintained that Coco was a bit spirited and rather cheeky. When the Crimean War dominated headlines, Coco seemed to absorb the barracks language pouring in through letters and returning soldiers. Some claimed the bird could mimic drum rolls and even shout military commands loudly and with feeling. But it was the swearing that stuck. Eventually, Coco had to be moved to a more secluded room when foreign dignitaries visited. Even so, Victoria never gave the bird up. In a strange way, it became a symbol of the empire itself, well-dressed, unpredictable, and just a little profane. Of course, not every royal got the luxury of dying in their own palace, surrounded by pets. One king's final moment came on the most literal throne of all. 15. King George II died on the toilet. Few monarchs get to exit the world with grandeur. King George II, however, left it with timing worthy of dark comedy. He died while seated on the royal toilet. Yes, on the throne, in every sense of the word. The official cause was a sudden heart issue, one of those tidy medical phrases historians use to cover what was probably an uncomfortable and deeply inconvenient passing. One moment he was reaching for his tea, the next, silence. When attendants found him, they were faced with the unenviable task of explaining to the royal family that the king had passed away mid-constitution. Now, George II wasn't exactly beloved, but he wasn't hated either. He was more tolerated. A German-born monarch who never quite mastered the English language, he spent much of his reign in a tense back and forth with Parliament. He loved war strategy, disliked his son, and had a temper sharp enough to slice through court etiquette. Still, there's something oddly fitting about his final scene. After all, he spent much of his reign asserting dominance, both militarily and domestically. To go out seated, in private, away from all the pomp he had tolerated but never truly enjoyed, that's almost poetic. And the British press, ever tactful, avoided the full story at the time. The public was told he died of sudden illness, but the staff knew, the doctors knew, the courtiers whispered it for decades. Eventually, historians stopped pretending. King George II, warrior, ruler, and the only British monarch known to have died quite so literally on his seat of power. But don't worry, his great-great-granddaughter would never have allowed such a scene. In fact, she used her purse as a silent code to escape awkward encounters before they even began. 16. Queen Elizabeth II owned more than 200 designer handbags and used them to send secret signals. While most monarchs carry ceremonial swords or scepters, Queen Elizabeth II's real instrument of power was her handbag. Not just any handbag, mind you. These were immaculately crafted Launer London pieces, often in black patent leather, always coordinated and always in hand. She reportedly had over 200 of them. But what the public didn't know, at least not at first, was that these weren't just fashion statements. They were code. Her Majesty used her purse to send silent messages to her staff, like a Morse code made of leather and royalty. If she shifted her handbag from her left arm to her right during a conversation, that was the cue for her aides to swoop in and politely interrupt. If she placed it on the floor, it meant she was bored, and someone needed to remove her from the conversation immediately. And if she placed it on the table at a dinner party, the countdown began. She wanted to leave within 5 minutes. No fuss, no whispers, just quiet, coordinated control. And it worked. With seamless efficiency, her staff would whisk her away from dull conversations, awkward small talk, or overzealous admirers, all under the illusion of natural rhythm. No raised eyebrows, no drama, just a subtle shift of a royal accessory. It's said she once used her handbag signal at a reception with a notoriously long-winded diplomat. Mid-sentence, the bag moved. The diplomat kept speaking. 3 minutes later, he was standing alone with a canapé and a question. Where did Her Majesty go? Her bag became a symbol of her quiet authority. Unlike many monarchs who bark orders or wave hands, Elizabeth II preferred elegance in her exits and the psychological edge of keeping everyone guessing. But while her accessories whispered royal intent, another king swore. His crown whispered something entirely different. Divine instructions in the middle of the night. 17. King Henry IV claimed the crown spoke to him in his sleep. Most rulers dream of power. King Henry IV took that literally. He believed his crown whispered to him as he slept. According to court accounts, Henry claimed to receive messages from the crown itself, divine murmurings that only he could hear. At night, as he lay in bed with the crown near his chambers, he insisted that the metal circlet didn't just sit silently on its velvet pillow. It spoke, quietly, urgently, about his duties, his destiny, and sometimes, ominously, his enemies. Whether these nocturnal proclamations were the result of illness, ambition, or medieval insomnia remains unclear. Henry's health was fragile. He suffered from seizures and likely endured chronic pain. But he was also deeply religious, and in a time when kings were considered God's chosen rulers, who's to say he didn't genuinely believe heaven had something to say to him through a piece of jewelry? His closest attendants were instructed not to move the crown at night. It had to be nearby, within whispering range. And though no one else ever heard it speak, Henry made decisions based on its counsel, including changes to court appointments and religious decrees. His confessor once suggested the whispers might be a metaphor. Henry promptly dismissed him. Metaphor, he said, does not demand tribute in blood. It's easy to laugh from a distance, but in Henry's time, such claims weren't seen as entirely irrational. Mysticism, symbolism, and power were all interwoven in royal life. And besides, who would question the man who wore the crown, especially if the crown itself was doing the talking? Still, if Henry IV had divine dreams, the king who followed not long after brought a far more mundane problem to the throne: language barriers. Specifically, he didn't speak the language of the country he ruled at all. 18. King George never learned English. It's not easy ruling a country where you don't speak the language, and King George I of Great Britain made exactly zero effort to fix that. Born and raised in Hanover, George was a German prince plucked from relative obscurity and handed the British crown in 1714, thanks to a complex web of dynastic succession and an English fear of Catholic monarchs. George was Protestant. That alone made him eligible. Speaking English, however, entirely optional apparently. George spoke German, some French, and a bit of Latin. English? Not a word. For years he conducted royal business through translators, sometimes using 2 or 3 intermediaries just to hold a conversation with his own ministers. It was like ruling through a very posh game of telephone. Parliament naturally wasn't thrilled. Neither were the British people, who found it absurd that their king couldn't even pronounce the names of the towns he governed. Satirists had a field day. Pamphlets mocked his accent. Caricatures depicted him muttering nonsense while courtiers nodded solemnly. One popular joke claimed that if you asked the king for directions, He'd reply in German and still point the wrong way. But George didn't care. He spent most of his time in London longing for Hanover, and most of his time in Hanover dreading his return to London. He once referred to England as that damp island. He attended cabinet meetings silently, let ministers argue, then nodded vaguely in whichever direction seemed least annoying. Some historians argue this made him a perfect constitutional monarch, present but not in the way. Despite the language gap, George's reign wasn't a disaster. It was just distant, silent, slightly confused. Still, his legacy was nothing compared to the bizarre legend surrounding his descendant, a queen whose body claimed pregnancy even when no child ever arrived. 19. Queen Mary. I thought she was pregnant, twice, but she wasn't Queen Mary Y of England, famously nicknamed Bloody Mary by her Protestant enemies, spent most of her short reign trying to reverse the English Reformation. But one of the strangest and most personal chapters of her monarchy had nothing to do with politics or religion. It was about a baby, or rather, the absence of one. In 1554, just a year after ascending the throne, Mary announced she was pregnant. The kingdom rejoiced. Court astrologers made predictions. Tailors began sewing royal baby gowns. A nursery was prepared. Mary herself began exhibiting all the signs: nausea, weight gain, a swelling belly. She stopped menstruating. Her ladies-in-waiting watched her walk the gardens with a hand protectively resting on her abdomen. But as the due date approached, something became clear. There was no baby, no labor, no child, no explanation. The court grew awkwardly silent. Some whispered that it had been a miscarriage. Others suspected a deception, political or otherwise. But the most plausible explanation was that Mary had suffered a condition now known as a phantom pregnancy, a rare psychosomatic experience where the body mimics pregnancy symptoms without the presence of an actual fetus. Rooted in deep psychological and emotional stress, it can fool even the most rational of minds. In Mary's case, the pressure was immense. She was 38, childless, and ruling in an era that judged a queen's worth by her ability to produce heirs. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was meant to secure a Catholic dynasty. Without an heir, her policies and her power were at risk. Tragically, it didn't just happen once. A few years later, she believed herself pregnant again. The kingdom braced itself once more. And again, nothing. No child, no resolution. Just a queen, heartbroken and confused, living in a palace filled with silence and empty cradles. Her body had betrayed her, or perhaps her mind had. Either way, her reign remained airless and haunted. But if Mary's illusions were maternal, her successor's fantasies were of a far more affectionate variety, and shared nightly with the young men he favored most. 20. King James slept with his favorite male courtiers in the same bed. King James I, the monarch who brought Scotland and England under a single crown, was also a man whose public persona and private inclinations rarely aligned. To the world, he was the embodiment of royal authority, a scholar, a theologian, the patron of the King James Bible. But behind palace doors, James had a deeply affectionate and unusually intimate relationship with several of his male courtiers. He wasn't shy about it either. His favorite was George Villiers, later Duke of Buckingham, a man James once referred to, in a letter, as "my sweet child and wife." The king showered George with titles, land, and gifts. They traveled together, dined together, and most famously, slept in the same bed. Now, in fairness, sharing a bed wasn't automatically scandalous in the 17th century. Beds were expensive, rooms were cold, and close companionship didn't necessarily imply romance. But in James's case, it wasn't just about shared warmth. His letters brim with adoration, flirtation, and declarations of love that made courtiers squirm and Parliament grumble. He had similar affections for other young men over the years, and though the court often whispered, James refused to apologize. "Christ had his John," he once snapped, "and I have my George." Biblical justification meets royal sass. Of course, whether these relationships were romantic in the way modern readers might imagine is still debated. But what's undeniable is the intensity of James's devotion. His male favorites had a level of access, intimacy, and influence that far surpassed most queens or advisors. And yet, this affection wasn't a scandal that brought down his reign. If anything, it made him seem oddly human, a man yearning for connection in a palace full of power games. Still, his great-great-great-granddaughter would one day reveal her own peculiar passion, not for people, but for pile drivers and power bombs. 21. Queen Elizabeth II loved watching wrestling. It's hard to imagine Queen Elizabeth II, monarch of the United Kingdom and defender of the faith, sitting down with a glass of Dubonnet to watch someone get body slammed. But according to several insiders and court gossip, Her Majesty had a surprising soft spot for professional wrestling. Yes, wrestling. The image is irresistible, the Queen of England, sitting in a private room, watching muscular men in spandex grapple, pin, and throw each other across the ring, while commentators shouted into microphones. It was, by all accounts, her guilty pleasure. Royal aides have hinted over the years that she appreciated the athleticism and showmanship, particularly during the heyday of British wrestling in the 1970s and 80s. Some even claim she had a fondness for certain wrestlers by name. Her loyalty, naturally, leaned toward British champions. She reportedly cheered when they defeated their American rivals. National pride, after all, doesn't take a day off. But perhaps what appealed most to the Queen was the theatricality of it all. Wrestling, in its odd way, mirrors royal life. Elaborate costumes, strict roles, carefully orchestrated drama, and a rigid sense of ritual. Heels and heroes. Boos and cheers. It's a performance, much like monarchy, except with more suplexes. Of course, the palace never officially confirmed this interest. It wasn't mentioned in state speeches or jubilee programs. But the rumor persisted, passed from staff to staff like a strange family heirloom. The idea of the Queen clapping for a pile driver was too delicious to forget. And who can blame her? After decades of ceremonies and constitutional restraint, watching someone get tossed out of a ring might have felt delightfully cathartic. Though Her Majesty's hobbies were discreet, the next king's idea of spiritual protection involved bones, saints, and the occasional holy relic tucked into his mattress. 22. King Edward I collected the bones of saints. Long before haunted dolls and celebrity NFTs, there was another elite collectible trend: saint bones. And King Edward I of England? He was all in. Reigning in the 13th century, Edward wasn't just a warrior king who loved long walks across conquered territory. He was also a devout believer in the power of holy relics, especially bones. Not just any bones, of course. These had to be authentic remains of saints, preferably with miraculous backstories, strange inscriptions, or at least a rumor of glowing in the dark. Edward had a whole collection: bones of apostles, chunks of sacred skulls, even finger bones attributed to martyrs who died in ways no polite conversation would entertain. He kept them in ornate containers called reliquaries, each more elaborate than the last. Gold, silver, gemstones. Think of it as medieval Pokemon, but with slightly higher spiritual stakes. To him, these relics weren't morbid, they were protective. He believed sleeping near them brought blessings. Traveling with them prevented defeat. Displaying them to his troops could boost morale and, ideally, intimidate the other side. After all, how do you fight a king armed not just with steel, but the blessed femur of St. Cuthbert? Edward even donated relics to religious institutions strategically, ensuring both divine favor and political leverage. Monks prayed for his victories. Bishops praised his piety. His enemies probably just found it creepy. But beyond the pageantry, there was a deep insecurity behind the collection. Edward, like many monarchs, feared the wrath of the divine far more than that of any rebel baron. Better to surround yourself with a few holy bones than risk the afterlife's judgment without backup. And while Edward sought divine protection, one queen sought divine scents, right down to the hour of the day, in a clock that didn't just tick, it perfumed. 23. Queen Elizabeth III owned a perfume clock. Time waits for no one, but it might smell a bit better when you're royalty. Queen Elizabeth III wasn't exactly a minimalist. Her court sparkled with embroidered gowns, bejeweled mirrors, and wigs that could block doorways. But among her most peculiar possessions was a perfumed clock, a device so rare and luxurious that even other monarchs probably raised an eyebrow. The concept? Simple. Every hour, on the hour, the clock would release a new fragrance. Think medieval air freshener, but handcrafted with oils from Damascus, musk from India, and rose petals from royal gardens. No batteries, of course. This was the 16th century. It likely worked through a clever mechanism of rotating scent chambers and tiny bellows that released the aroma. When the bell struck, so did the bouquet. Elizabeth adored perfumes. Her personal chambers were said to smell like a walking apothecary. Lavender, orange blossom, frankincense, and a dash of something expensive. The perfumed clock wasn't just decorative, it was a status symbol. A message that even time itself, in her presence, had to arrive sweetly scented. Guests were impressed. Ambassadors wrote about it in their letters. Some nobles allegedly tried to copy the design, but none could replicate the craftsmanship. After all, it wasn't just about luxury, it was about control. Elizabeth didn't just rule her court. She choreographed it. Every movement, every glance, every breath of lavender-scented air was intentional. And it wasn't all for pleasure. In a court riddled with plague, poor hygiene, and suspicious odors, scent was both shield and sword. The clock wasn't just pretty, it was armor. Still, while Elizabeth was mastering the air, one of her successors was obsessing over floors, walls, and linens. Because what's a throne, really, if the castle isn't spotless? 24. King Henry VII was obsessed with cleaning. King Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, may have won the crown at Bosworth Field, but he fought his greatest battles against dust, dirt, and untidy bedclothes. In an age when personal hygiene was largely theoretical and royal palaces doubled as semi-controlled health hazards, Henry stood out. He wasn't just cleaner than most medieval monarchs. He was obsessed. His chambers were cleaned obsessively. His clothes were inspected daily. And his bed linens? Changed every single day, no exceptions. He demanded that his floors be scrubbed with rose water, not simply for scent, but to keep evil spirits, and probably actual rats, at bay. Servants were instructed to sweep corners thoroughly. Furniture was to be dusted down with linen cloths, not just beaten with sticks as was custom elsewhere. One courtier reportedly described the king's quarters as cleaner than reason. Historians have puzzled over the root of this royal neat freakery. Some suggest it was psychological, a method of asserting control in a court rife with intrigue and betrayal. Others say it was political. After all, Henry had taken the throne from Richard III under controversial circumstances. Cleanliness may have been part of crafting a new image, orderly, pure, divinely approved. But others think it was just Henry being Henry. He didn't like surprises, he didn't like chaos, and he certainly didn't like crumbs on his embroidered tapestries. And his fixation went beyond surfaces. He micromanaged the royal laundry system. He had favorite soap mixtures. He even created rotating schedules for chambermaids to ensure no one got lazy with the corner sweeping. In short, if Henry VII had access to modern disinfectant, he'd have bathed in it. But while he scrubbed his palace into sparkling submission, his descendant Victoria delegated her cleanliness to someone else entirely. A Scottish servant with one very awkward job. 25. Queen Victoria hired a servant to warm her toilet. Seat royal dignity comes in many forms. In Queen Victoria's case, it came in the shape of a pre-warmed seat. Victoria ruled over the largest empire the world had ever seen, with dominions that stretched across continents. But even emperors have everyday needs. And the Queen, ever particular, did not believe in facing the chill of a cold toilet seat, not even for the glory of the British Empire. Enter John Brown, a trusted Scottish servant, fiercely loyal, ruggedly informal, and deeply attached to the Queen, emotionally and, apparently, logistically. Among his many responsibilities, making sure Her Majesty's throne was suitably pre-warmed. No, there wasn't a royal gadget for the task, not yet at least. This was the 19th century. The warming was done the old-fashioned way, with proximity, cushions, hot water bottles, or, according to some accounts, just sitting. Brown became more than a servant. He was Victoria's confidant, walking companion, and possibly the only person in the palace who dared to speak to her like an actual human being. Their relationship was the subject of endless court gossip, especially when it emerged that he had a key to her private chambers and a special place in her will. But to Victoria, Brown was loyal, dependable, and unshakably Scottish. The Queen even commissioned portraits of him and insisted on keeping his photograph beside her bed long after his death. For a monarch so famously reserved in public, her fondness for Brown bordered on romantic, or at the very least, deeply personal. So yes, Victoria may have ruled the world, but she also needed comfort, and she wasn't above delegating the awkward task of ensuring it. But if her loyalty to Brown was intimate, the next king's loyalty to conversation was, well, relentless. Once he started talking, not even exhaustion or reality could stop him. 26. King George III talked nonstop for hours. When King George III spoke, people listened. At first. Eventually, though, they mostly just nodded. The king, plagued by recurring bouts of mental instability, had episodes where speech became both his outlet and his cage. The most infamous account? He once talked for 58 hours straight. Not a typo. Nearly 2.5 days of continuous verbal output, delivered with the urgency of a man unraveling and the clarity of one who believed every word was important, even the ones that contradicted the previous sentence. Court physicians recorded it with a mixture of alarm and awe. Servants whispered about the endless monologue. Subjects, hearing whispers of the event, wondered if their king was possessed, divinely inspired, or simply never ran out of breath. He talked about politics. He talked about theology. He talked about farm animals, the weather, the workings of Parliament, and the names of everyone he had ever met. The problem wasn't just that he wouldn't stop, it's that he couldn't. His mind, for reasons still debated by historians, wouldn't allow silence. And so, for nearly 60 hours, the palace was filled with the sound of one man narrating his own unraveling. George III's condition has since been attributed to porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder, or possibly bipolar disorder. Both were undiagnosed at the time, and neither offered any royal exemption. His ramblings were tragic, often profound, and occasionally peppered with eerie lucidity. He once declared, "I have become like a clock wound too tight." And never has a metaphor landed so hard. Yet despite his mental deterioration, George III remained respected. He was called Farmer George for his love of agriculture. He adored his wife and children, and many saw his suffering as noble, an affliction endured, not escaped. Still, if George's tongue ran endlessly, the next queen's extravagance extended in a different direction, into the vast, glittering chambers of her wardrobe. 27. Queen Elizabeth II had over 3,000 dresses. Most monarchs measure their reigns in wars, treaties, and heirs. Queen Elizabeth I measured part of hers in silk, embroidery, and the ever-expanding architecture of her closet. Over 3,000 gowns. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's a documented inventory, spanning fabrics from every corner of her empire, colors so rare they had to be invented, and stitching so intricate it could make a modern fashion house weep. Elizabeth didn't just wear clothing, she weaponized it. Her wardrobe wasn't about vanity, well, not just vanity. It was politics, power, propaganda stitched into sleeves. Each dress was a carefully curated symbol of dominance, flashing gold to intimidate ambassadors, wearing black to mourn, wearing white to appear above mortal stain. She dressed like an icon because she understood that in a world ruled by men, a woman had to look divine to be treated seriously. Many of her gowns were encrusted with real pearls, diamonds, and embroidered scenes of religious or imperial symbolism. Lions, suns, phoenixes, Tudor roses, all carefully selected. Tailors worked around the clock. Wigs, collars, and layers upon layers of fabric transformed her into something almost mythological. Her courtiers took the hint. They began blackening their teeth to match hers. Sugar decay had its own fashion moment. They powdered their faces to mimic her alabaster mask of youth. Her wardrobe didn't just dominate fashion, it dictated it. But this massive collection wasn't stored in some royal walk-in closet. It took up entire rooms. Attendants were assigned just to maintain, organize, and catalog the gowns. Think museum archive meets runway show meets battlefield armor. To the outside world, Elizabeth was the Virgin Queen. To those inside her palace, she was a dazzling, mercurial force who could rewrite reality, one outfit at a time. But if she ruled through fabric and image, her notorious ancestor had once brushed his royal teeth with something far less glamorous: boar bristles and a toothbrush made of gold. 28. King Henry VIII's toothbrush was made of gold and boar bristles. Before electric toothbrushes, fluoride, and minty fresh marketing campaigns, there was King Henry VIII, polishing his royal molars with a brush made of gold and the stiff bristles of a boar. The toothbrush, one of the first documented in English history, was a lavish gift from the French court. Gold handle, hand-stitched bristles, travel case. It wasn't so much a hygiene product as it was a dental scepter, a royal accessory meant to clean and impress. Like everything Henry owned, it wasn't just functional, it was flamboyant. This was a man who measured self-worth in grandeur. 6 wives, acres of banquets, a treasury of jousting armor, and, yes, personalized dental tools. His hygiene habits may not have matched his appetite, but he was at least aware enough to scrub what feasts left behind. Though dental science at the time was, shall we say, rudimentary, Henry's golden toothbrush was part of a broader obsession with presentation. He knew appearances mattered. His court was one of glittering pageantry, and rotten breath didn't pair well with diplomacy. The boar bristles, while coarse, were the standard of the day. Horsehair and feathers had been tried and failed. Boar bristles were the best a 16th century monarch could get. They were stiff enough to do the job but not soft enough to be comfortable. Royal gums were likely sacrificed for the cause. Interestingly, historians note that despite having a brush made from literal treasure, Henry still suffered from dental issues later in life, likely due to his love of sweets and wines. Still, one has to admire the commitment to brushing. When other monarchs were still gargling with vinegar, he was buffing his teeth with gold. And if Henry VIII's self-image was all about shine and swagger, his son, well, let's just say he brought the party to the palace by popularizing a word still used today, merry. 29. King Charles II popularized the word merry. If King Charles further died in somber silence, his son Charles II made it his royal mission to never let England forget how to laugh again. After years of Puritan rule in the gray, sermon-heavy regime of Oliver Cromwell, Charles II swaggered back onto the throne in 1660 with enough charisma to light 1,000 chandeliers. He brought back music, dancing, theater, flirtation, chocolate, wigs, dogs, and questionable decisions. But perhaps his most enduring contribution? He rebranded the monarchy as merry. Yes, merry, as in jolly, carefree, delightfully unbothered. Before Charles, the word had religious and seasonal overtones. Merry Christmas, for example, was more liturgical than lively. But under Charles, it became cultural currency. It was how people described his court, his moods, his behavior, and eventually, the entire Restoration era. He was dubbed the Merry Monarch, and the name stuck like cheap perfume in a crowded ballroom. Charles was constantly surrounded by mistresses, actors, and philosophers. He loved witty banter as much as he loved practical jokes. He gave money to poets and science grants to Isaac Newton. One minute he was in bed with a duchess, the next he was in a lab dissecting a dolphin. Unpredictable, but always amused. Of course, his reign wasn't all light-hearted debauchery. There were crises, plague, fire, naval wars. But even then, Charles somehow maintained a tone of irreverent resilience. He embodied contradiction, a ruler who mocked his own role, yet clung to its power, a king who could pass laws by day and sneak out of masquerade balls by night. He made being king look like fun, which, after decades of divine rigidity, was its own kind of rebellion. And yet, for all his clever evasions, Charles's successor had trust issues so intense, he refused to sleep on the ground, literally. 30. King William III slept in a bed, suspended from the ceiling. Most kings fear rebellion. William III feared underneath. When he took the English throne alongside Queen Mary II in 1689, William of Orange brought not just a new political era, but an intense paranoia about being assassinated in his sleep. So he came up with a solution. No one could stab you from under the bed if there was no under to begin with. His bed was suspended from the ceiling. Yes, suspended. Not just high off the ground, but physically rigged with chains or ropes to dangle from the rafters. Think medieval security system meets Gothic hammock. The idea was simple. Eliminate hiding places. If your bed floats, nobody's lurking beneath it with a dagger and a grudge. It sounds theatrical, but this was no eccentric flourish. William had reasons to be cautious. He'd survived plots, uprisings, and attempted assassinations. His reign was born of revolution, the so-called Glorious Revolution to be exact. And not everyone was thrilled about it. Paranoia wasn't just reasonable, it was strategic. There were other precautions too. He traveled with armed guards, used taste testers, and trusted very few with access to his sleeping quarters. But the floating bed became the symbol of his nocturnal anxieties and, ironically, his practicality. Contemporaries noted his habit of sleeping lightly and waking at the faintest sound. He was a military man after all. Beds were never just for rest. They were battlegrounds of vulnerability. And William, who fought his way into kingship, never forgot that. The bed eventually disappeared from historical records, perhaps dismantled after his death or hidden away in a forgotten corner of a palace. But where William saw danger in darkness, his co-ruler Mary II saw charm in far gentler things, like taxidermy, seashells, and the strange comfort of feathered creatures who never flew again. 31. Queen Victoria's mourning outfits were tailor-made by a psychic. Queen Victoria spent over 40 years mourning her husband. And while most widows eventually rotate their wardrobe back into color, Victoria went in the other direction. She expanded her collection of black dresses so dramatically that it became not only a fashion statement, but a full-time royal aesthetic. But the strangest part? Many of these mourning outfits were designed under the guidance of a psychic. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, Victoria was inconsolable. She withdrew from public life, wrote endlessly in her journals, and refused to wear anything other than black silk and jet jewelry. But as the years went by and the mourning period became a lifestyle, her interest turned spiritual. Seances, mediums, messages from beyond the veil. If Albert couldn't return in person, perhaps he could offer wardrobe advice from the afterlife. She became enamored with a spiritualist who claimed to receive fashion instructions from the late prince himself. Through mysterious whispers, the psychic received preferences on fabric weight, hem length, veil transparency, and even the symbolic placement of black lace. And the queen? She listened. Orders were relayed to her royal dressmakers who, though baffled, complied without question. Imagine being a tailor told, "His Highness prefers fewer buttons this month," from the other side. The result was a wardrobe of intense symbolism. Each piece of clothing wasn't just functional. It was a love letter to a ghost. Black crepe gowns, floor-length veils, mourning caps, all chosen to reflect an eternal sorrow Victoria had no intention of leaving behind. The public at first sympathized. Then they grew restless. "Why is she still hiding?" they whispered. But Victoria didn't care. Her fashion was private ritual, not public display. Her mourning was active, orchestrated, and, thanks to her favorite medium, oddly collaborative. If Victoria spent decades conversing with spirits, her successor was more into color, specifically one color, which he wanted to paint an entire castle in. 32. King George IV tried to decorate Windsor Castle. Entirely in pink. Say what you want about King George IV. He was dramatic, indulgent, over-accessorized, and rarely subtle. But he had one undeniable quality: commitment to a vibe. And that vibe, toward the latter part of his life, was pink. Not just a dash here and there. He wanted the entire royal residence to be blushing. Yes, Windsor Castle, home to centuries of monarchs, host to foreign dignitaries, and symbol of British endurance, nearly became a giant strawberry bonbon under George IV's vision. After ascending the throne in 1820, George launched into an ambitious redesign of the royal interiors. No surface was too sacred, no column too untouched. He envisioned elaborate fabrics, plush carpets, ornate gilding, and walls painted in varying shades of rose, coral, salmon, and blush. Bedrooms, sitting rooms, staircases. If it had a surface, it was on the pink list. His inspiration? Likely a blend of Parisian decadence, Rococo excess, and a personal fondness for soft hues that flattered candlelight. Also, George IV was a bit of a romantic. Underneath the corsets and powdered wigs was a man who believed deeply in visual storytelling. And his story? A castle dipped in raspberry cream. Naturally, the architects were horrified. Some called it a theatrical affliction. Others just quietly wept into their blueprints. Eventually, compromises were made. Many rooms received the pink treatment, but the full rose vision was scaled back. Tradition had its limits, even for a king with a gilded sugar tooth. Today, traces of his obsession remain in certain rooms: subtle blush tones in drapery and upholstery, remnants of a monarch who saw no contradiction in ruling an empire while lounging under pink silk ceilings. If George IV used color to assert taste, his great-great-grandmother once weaponized decay as style. In her court, rotting teeth weren't hidden. They were imitated. 33. Queen Elizabeth I. Loved sugar so much her teeth turned black. Queen Elizabeth I had pearls on her gowns, diamonds on her shoes, and sugar on just about everything else. She was notoriously fond of sweet things: marzipan, candied violets, preserved fruits, and sugar-dusted cakes that would make modern dentists cry. But sugar in the 16th century wasn't the hidden menace we know today. It was a symbol of wealth, trade, and courtly sophistication. If you could afford sugar, you flaunted it, and Elizabeth could afford a lot of it. Over time, her excessive consumption led to predictable consequences: dental decay. Her teeth turned dark, even blackened, and chewing became difficult. But in true Elizabethan fashion, the Queen didn't just live with it, she made it fashion. Soon, courtiers began blackening their own teeth to mimic hers. Yes, on purpose. Women painted on dark streaks to signal that they too were refined enough to rot from sweetness. In an ironic twist, the very thing that was eroding Elizabeth's smile became a status symbol. Tooth rot, but make it royal. It's worth noting that dental care in the 1500s was less than ideal. Toothbrushes were rare, dentistry was more guesswork than science, and treatments involved herbs, vinegar, or, if things got really bad, pliers. So Elizabeth's black teeth weren't unusual for the time. What was unusual was how she turned a side effect into courtly trendsetting. Foreign ambassadors often noted her striking appearance, the white painted face, crimson lips, elaborate ruffs, and a barely concealed grimace. But none of it slowed her down. She continued to receive dignitaries, dance at masques, and flash her fashionable smile, black teeth and all. Because for Elizabeth, image was everything. And if sugar brought a little decay with it, well, so did power. Next in line, a king who also wanted to redefine royal duty by turning hunting and sports into spiritual exercises. 34. King Henry VIII tried to create his own religion of fitness. By the time King Henry VIII reached middle age, he had done what few could, dismantled a church, reshaped a nation, and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. But there was one domain he felt had been spiritually neglected: the royal hunting grounds. Enter Henry's peculiar and deeply personal theology of fitness. In the early years of his reign, Henry was the poster monarch for athleticism. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and competitive to a fault. He jousted, fenced, hawked, and hunted with an almost manic devotion. So when his political and religious authority expanded, so did his belief that sporting activities were not just pastimes, they were divine acts. He declared that engaging in physical pursuits, particularly hunting and archery, was a kind of spiritual service. Exercise kept the body pure, the mind sharp, and the nation's warriors ready. To sit idly, he argued, was to sin against both God and country. He wasn't joking. Royal proclamations were issued declaring certain sports to be moral duties. Young men were expected to train their bodies as they would their souls. Missing archery practice could even lead to a fine. And of course, at the center of this new holy gymnasium stood Henry himself, the king as divine sportsman. He believed that being seen in peak physical form reinforced his status as God's chosen sovereign. His muscles were as much political propaganda as his coronation robes. Naturally, this divine workout plan took a nosedive in his later years as his health collapsed and his waistline expanded. But even then, Henry continued to speak of sports with reverence. He held tournaments, watched from padded chairs, and insisted on overseeing hunting parties, even if he could no longer ride. His fitness theology may not have survived the Reformation, but the echoes remained. Power, in Henry's world, was not only spiritual and political, it was physical. And while Henry thundered through forests in pursuit of holiness on horseback, the next monarch tried and failed 18 times to birth a legacy, only to find her greatest passion lay in the roll of the dice. 35. Queen Anne had 18 pregnancies, but loved gambling more than babies. Queen Anne's reign is often remembered for political unions, war victories, and an empire expanding across the sea. But behind the stately portraits and parliamentary acts was a private life marked by heartbreak and a peculiar obsession with cards. Anne endured an astonishing 18 pregnancies, yet not a single child lived to adulthood. Some were stillborn, others died young. The palace corridors, once meant to echo with royal footsteps, remained heartbreakingly quiet. And in that silence, Anne turned to gambling. She didn't just dabble, she thrived at it. Card games became her comfort, her escape, her nightly routine. She was particularly fond of ombre and basset, two complex, high-stakes games popular among European courts. She played for hours, often betting substantial sums from her private purse. Ministers occasionally worried about her debts. Advisors fretted that state affairs were being delayed for one more round. Anne didn't care. To her, cards weren't just recreation, they were structure. In a life full of medical failures, court betrayals, and deep personal losses, the rules of a card game were something she could control. Win or lose, the stakes made sense. Unlike fate, which had denied her the one thing every queen was expected to provide, an heir. Even during illness, Anne demanded the game table be brought to her bedside. Servants were expected to shuffle with care, and courtiers quickly learned not to interrupt her during a winning streak. She could be generous in victory and sullen in loss, but she was never indifferent. Some historians have called it escapism. Others have framed it as addiction. But whatever the reason, Anne's love of gambling added another layer to her complex character. A ruler navigating personal tragedy by placing bets on chance, over and over again. And while she sought control in the turn of a card, the next king found comfort in something far simpler. A dog's blanket tucked gently beneath his royal pillow. 36. King James I slept with his dog's blanket. King James I, literary patron, Bible commissioner, witch hunter, was also, in his quieter moments, something of a sentimental softy, and nothing demonstrated this better than his odd, endearing sleep ritual. He refused to rest without his dog's blanket nearby. The blanket belonged to his favorite spaniel, a beloved little creature that accompanied him almost everywhere. At court, on hunts, even in Parliament, where it once allegedly sneezed during a particularly boring speech. But it wasn't just the dog he adored. It was everything associated with it, including its sleeping rug. James claimed he couldn't drift off without the familiar scent and warmth of the dog's blanket close at hand. It calmed him, grounded him, made the vast candlelit silence of royal bedrooms slightly less intimidating. When traveling, his attendants were instructed to pack the blanket first. Not the crown, not the regalia, the blanket. Now James was a complicated man. He ruled 2 kingdoms, navigated deep religious divides, and wielded immense power. But in private, he was riddled with insecurities, superstitions, and a deep need for familiarity. The blanket became a symbol of that, comfort in a life that rarely allowed it. Courtiers found it strange. Some mocked it quietly. Others chalked it up to royal eccentricity. But none dared remove it. The king's rest depended on it, and an unrested monarch was a dangerous monarch. Eventually, the dog passed on, as all dogs do. But the blanket stayed. Frayed, faded, and patched up over the years, it remained folded on the edge of James's bed until his final days. If nothing else, it reminded everyone that even kings, those who write laws and command armies, sometimes just want the smell of home. Though the next royal in line didn't sleep with blankets or spaniels. Instead, he threw court-sponsored competitions for people who could make him laugh the loudest. 37. King Henry II created Court Jesters Olympics. Most monarchs used jesters to lighten the mood. King Henry II turned them into athletes. In the 12th century, long before game shows or televised talent competitions, Henry devised what may be the earliest recorded royal comedy tournament. A bizarre event in which court jesters competed in a series of strange and often humiliating challenges to see who could be the funniest, cleverest, or just most outrageous. The prize? Gold, wine, a place at the king's personal table, and most importantly, Henry's laughter. The Jesters' Olympics, as later historians nicknamed it, included events like competitive burping, insult duels, rhyming battles, and physical slapstick routines judged by the royal family. One challenge involved improvising a 5-minute poem about Henry's dinner. Another tested who could wear the most ridiculous outfit made entirely from kitchen scraps. Henry loved it. He would sit on his throne, surrounded by nobles pretending not to cringe, while grown men in mismatched tights tried to juggle raw fish or compose love sonnets to turnips. The court had no choice but to watch. When the king laughed, you laughed. This wasn't just a vanity project. It was calculated court politics. Henry used comedy to test loyalty, mock rivals, and relieve pressure from his increasingly tense court. The jesters, often low-born but quick-witted, could say things no noble dared utter aloud. In jest, of course, but with eyes wide open. One jester, named Roland, became so good at roasting the king's enemies that he was granted land, making him the only person in England to acquire property by making fart jokes in verse. Henry's obsession with court humor eventually faded as political conflicts escalated, but the legacy lingered. The idea that wit could win favor, and even power, remained deeply embedded in royal culture. Of course, centuries later, another monarch would bring the absurdity full circle, not with jesters, but with fast food royalty, served on her own royal land. 38. Queen Elizabeth II had her own McDonald's. For a monarch known for grace, pearls, and a wardrobe the size of a small continent, Queen Elizabeth II had one peculiar footnote to her real estate empire. She technically owned a McDonald's. Located in Banbury Gateway Shopping Park in Oxfordshire, this fully operational fast food franchise sits on Crown Estate land. That means the land it occupies belongs to the reigning monarch, not personally, but as part of the institution of the monarchy. Still, the optics were deliciously ironic. One of the most powerful women in the world who dined with presidents and sipped tea with silverware older than the United States also presided, however indirectly, over a restaurant serving Big Macs and milkshakes. The McDonald's in question isn't your average pit stop either. It has leather seating, digital menus, and table service. Fit for a queen? Perhaps, though no confirmed reports suggest Elizabeth ever stopped by for a filet-o-fish on her way back from Sandringham. The idea of the Queen owning a McDonald's became a running joke in British media. Satirical sketches imagined her placing drive-through orders in flawless received pronunciation. Memes proliferated of royal corgis ordering fries. But the truth, as always, is more mundane. Crown land is vast and diverse. It includes farms, forests, wind farms, shopping centers, and yes, even the occasional golden-arched franchise. The Queen herself likely didn't think much of it. Her relationship with fast food was non-existent. Her menus were curated, her chefs Michelin tier, and her idea of a snack involved bone china and scones. Still, the idea of McDonald's under the royal umbrella was a reminder that the monarchy, for all its formality, remained stitched into the daily life of the nation, even at the drive-thru. And if Elizabeth ruled over burgers in the modern age, one of her ancestors was gifted a much more exotic creature, a royal present with tusks, a trunk, and a dangerous taste for wine. 39. King Henry VIII once received a live elephant as a gift. When it came to royal gifts, King Henry VIII had high expectations. Jewels? Nice. Weapons? Better. But in 1514, the King of Portugal decided to raise the stakes and sent Henry something truly unforgettable. A live elephant. Yes, an elephant. Delivered by ship, paraded through the streets of London, and housed at the Tower of London, which in addition to being a fortress and prison, also served as the Tudor version of a royal zoo. At the time, England had never seen anything quite like it. Most people had never even imagined such a creature. Elephants were the stuff of legend, illustrations, and unreliable travelers' tales. And suddenly, there it was, massive, gray, wrinkled, and undeniably real. The elephant became an immediate sensation. Crowds gathered at the tower to catch a glimpse. Nobles made excuses to stop by and marvel. Children whispered that it could speak in ancient languages. And Henry? He adored the spectacle. This was more than a pet. It was a political flex, proof of England's growing stature, foreign alliances, and kingly magnificence. But there was a problem. No one knew how to take care of it. Cold English winters weren't exactly pachyderm-friendly, nor were medieval feeding habits. Someone apparently had the bright idea to give the elephant wine, daily, gallons of it. Perhaps they thought it would warm the beast, or perhaps they just assumed every creature at Henry's court needed a drink. Either way, the elephant endured what must have been a very confusing stint as royal entertainment. Unfortunately, it didn't survive long. After a couple of years, the elephant passed away, likely from a mix of poor diet, cold climate, and general neglect. But the story lived on. A strange, nearly mythical footnote in Henry VIII's already surreal biography. Because when you're a king known for breaking from Rome, founding your own church, and collecting wives like trading cards, why not add an elephant to the list? Coming up next, a queen whose obsession with breakfast was so precise, even boiled eggs feared her disapproval. 40. Queen Victoria's favorite breakfast was boiled eggs, each timed exactly 4 minutes. If the devil is in the details, Queen Victoria ran her palace like a very polite purgatory. Nowhere was this more evident than in her breakfast routine, which centered around one humble yet highly politicized item, the boiled egg. But not just any egg. It had to be timed exactly 4 minutes. Not a second more, not a second less. The yolk had to be perfectly soft. No runniness, no chalkiness, no room for interpretation. And in the event of even the slightest deviation, the entire tray was sent back. Rejected. Unworthy of royal digestion. The kitchen staff lived in fear of these eggs. More than one footman, it's said, lost his post over a poorly timed yolk. Chefs had to prepare multiple batches each morning, all staggered by seconds. One batch boiled for 3:55, another for 4 o'clock, another for 4:05, just in case Her Majesty's timing sense required a range of soft-boiled options. And if you're wondering how many eggs the Queen actually ate, often just one, maybe two. The rest were for backup. But those backups weren't wasted. Once rejected, the eggs were eaten by the lower-ranking servants, meaning entire wings of the palace began their day with surplus eggs, all calibrated to Victoria's morning whims. Her breakfast table, like everything else in her life, was a carefully curated performance. White linen, sterling silver, a selection of jams and breads, and always the eggs. It wasn't about luxury, it was about precision. Victoria believed in order, discipline, and monarchy as ritual. Even her breakfast had to convey that. It's hard not to imagine a kitchen under quiet siege each morning, chefs sweating, timers ticking, one poor scullery maid whispering, "Not again," as a tray of eggs goes cold. Yet if Victoria's obsession was culinary, the next monarch's was olfactory, a royal nose that couldn't tolerate a certain pungent herb and didn't care who knew it. 41. King James I hated garlic. King James I, the scholarly monarch who gave the world the King James Bible and a royal treatise on witches, had one unshakable culinary conviction. Garlic was the devil's breath. Not just unpleasant, not overpowering. To James, garlic was nothing short of a sensory assault. He banned it from court meals entirely. No sauces, no seasonings, no traces in kitchens. Even garlic-adjacent foods were subject to scrutiny. It wasn't just personal preference, it was policy. Foreign dignitaries were warned in advance. Ambassadors from France and Italy, both garlic-friendly nations, found themselves politely asked to abstain from any contact with the bulb prior to royal audiences. One French envoy was reportedly advised to stand at least 4 paces back after his last garlicky dinner offended the king's nostrils during a handshake. James wasn't subtle about it either. He believed garlic made people coarse, unrefined, unfit for the elevated society he believed the royal court represented. And in an era where bathing was optional and perfume did the heavy lifting, garlic's scent stood out like a blaring horn at a madrigal recital. Some historians speculate the aversion was medical, perhaps tied to migraines or sensitivities. Others say it was simply psychological. James had a lifelong obsession with cleanliness and a fear of disease. To him, garlic was too raw, too rustic, too associated with the lower classes and their garlic-laden stews. His distaste went so far as to affect royal menus. Entire cuisines were rewritten to suit his palate. Cooks were retrained. Recipes retooled. Garlic became court poison, culinary contraband that could sabotage your career. But while James fled from strong smells, his descendant ran headlong into theatrical transformation, wearing not one, not two, but over 80 wigs, each as fiery red and mythologically styled as the Queen herself. 42. Queen Elizabeth I's hair wasn't real. By the end of her reign, Queen Elizabeth I was more icon than individual, a walking emblem of divine authority, national identity, and political theater. But the crown wasn't the only part of her look that sat above her head. Most of her famous red curls? Not hers. She owned over 80 wigs, each one meticulously styled, powdered, and arranged to reflect a very specific version of herself. The eternal virgin queen, untouchable and unaging. These weren't just vanity accessories, they were political camouflage. In her youth, Elizabeth had fiery red hair, genetically gifted by her Tudor lineage. But age, stress, and illness did what they always do. Her hair thinned. The color faded. Rather than reveal that reality, she adapted. Wig makers were brought in, stylists trained. Her wigs became architectural marvels, some piled high in intricate braids, others coiled to mimic classical Roman goddesses. She used them not only to conceal age, but to control narrative. Red hair was rare and powerful. It was linked to her father, Henry VIII, and helped her visually distinguish herself from other monarchs. Each wig reinforced the image of a queen untouched by time. To see her unchanged was to believe in her permanence, and belief was half the battle. The wigs were paired with her infamous white lead makeup, her ornate ruffs, and her jewel-encrusted gowns. Her entire appearance was an illusion, constructed daily by a team of trusted attendants. A mask of youth, a theater of monarchy. Foreign ambassadors noted the effort. They described her hair with admiration, often failing to mention, or perhaps failing to realize, that it was not attached to her scalp. But then, that was the point. The illusion was working. And while Elizabeth's royal image towered above her head, another king preferred his legacy to loom on the wall, where he could stare at himself forever, in frame after oversized, self-aggrandizing frame. 43. King George IV had an obsession with giant portraits of himself. If self-confidence were a building material, King George IV could have constructed a second Buckingham Palace out of pure ego. George IV wasn't satisfied with the usual royal portraits, the tasteful half-lengths or the dignified side profiles. No, he preferred portraits so massive they could block a draft and in which he always looked taller, thinner, more heroic, and significantly more Greek god-adjacent than he ever appeared in real life. At a time when the royal waistline was rapidly expanding beyond Regency tailoring, George commissioned paintings where he appeared in shining armor, toga-like robes, or dramatic mythological costumes. Mars, Apollo, even Hercules. He wanted to be seen as more than a king. He wanted to be a legend. And legends don't slouch or sweat or eat 12-course banquets followed by 20 cigarettes and a nap. Many of these portraits were huge, measuring well over 8 feet high, and were strategically placed throughout his residences, Carlton House, Windsor Castle, and later, the newly remodeled Buckingham Palace. Walking through his halls meant navigating a gallery of himself, larger than life, impossibly polished, forever heroic. He paid handsomely for the flattery. Artists who painted him realistically rarely received a second commission. Sir Thomas Lawrence, one of the great court painters of the time, managed to master the delicate balance between artistry and ego management, painting the king with just enough divine glow to keep his job. Servants whispered that he often stopped to admire the portraits when passing them. Some said he talked to them. Whether that's true or not, what's undeniable is the sheer volume of George IV staring down from oil and canvas in any room he entered. It was vanity. It was insecurity. It was branding before branding was a thing. And while George wallpapered the palace with his own face, his ancestor Queen Victoria found herself haunted by another's, her husband's. So much so, she gave his clothes away in hopes his spirit might linger in the seams. 44. Queen Victoria gave her husband's clothes to their servant after his death. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria did not merely mourn, she transformed mourning into monarchy. She wore black for the next 40 years. She withdrew from public life. She turned every room he touched into a shrine. But one of her most quietly eerie acts of grief was giving his clothing, not to museums or to storage, but to their servant, John Brown. Brown had been Albert's trusted gillie, a Scottish servant with a stubborn streak and a wild beard. After Albert's death, he became Victoria's closest companion. Some say confidant, some say more. Either way, their bond became legendary and controversial. Victoria gave Brown Prince Albert's clothes, his boots, his jackets, his trousers, even his dressing gowns. Not as keepsakes, but with the quiet belief that if someone wore them, Albert's spirit might still be near. She instructed Brown to wear them regularly, which he did, walking through palace corridors and royal grounds in the dead man's tailored legacy. Imagine it, a servant dressed in royal garments acting as both companion and living relic. He became a physical memory, a walking shadow of the prince consort. Some courtiers were horrified, others whispered, but Victoria did not care. To her, Brown was loyal, honest, earthy. He made her laugh when few others dared speak. And in wearing Albert's clothes, he was performing a kind of sacred duty, keeping the king, not just the memory, alive. Historians have speculated endlessly about the psychological implications. Was it superstition, spiritualism, just raw grief in physical form? Whatever the truth, the gesture was deeply Victorian, equal parts sentimental and strange, dignified and unsettling. She did what any monarch might do when love and loss collide. She made ritual out of pain. And while Victoria surrounded herself with the scent of the departed, her great-grandson would fill his royal lungs with something else entirely. An absurd cocktail of 12 cigars and 20 cigarettes a day. 45. King Edward VII smoked 12 cigars and 20 cigarettes a day. King Edward VII lived life like it was a rich dessert, and he never skipped seconds. But if there was one vice that truly defined his day-to-day royal rhythm, it was tobacco. Mountains of it. By the time he ascended the throne in 1901, Edward was already infamous for his indulgences. But even by Victorian and Edwardian standards, his smoking habit was staggering: 12 cigars and 20 cigarettes per day. He began early. Breakfast often featured not just bacon and eggs, but a cigar. Meetings were held in a fog of smoke. Even his portraits often depict him with a cigar in hand, so frequently, in fact, that it became part of his public identity. The British press, with a mixture of concern and exasperation, gave him the nickname Edward the Coughing. This wasn't some aristocratic affectation. Edward was committed. His cigars were Cuban, of course, custom-made and shipped in wooden crates bearing the royal seal. The cigarettes? Rolled to his specification and often lit for him by staff. The smell of tobacco clung to his clothes, his furniture, even the tapestries of royal halls. Doctors warned him. He wheezed, coughed, sometimes canceled events due to chest discomfort. But to Edward, the smoke was a part of the performance. It made him feel modern, worldly, masculine. Inhaling fire was just another way to project control. His staff, meanwhile, learned to adapt. Rooms were ventilated, curtains washed weekly. Visitors were advised not to wear light colors unless they wanted to smell like ash for days. It's hard to imagine a more literal example of royal excess. His lungs taxed daily under the weight of vanity, boredom, and sheer royal habit. Still, even Edward never expected his throne to play music when he sat down. But one king did, and naturally it had horns. 46. King Henry VIII made a mechanical throne that played music. When most kings sat on their thrones, it was meant to be a solemn, commanding gesture. When King Henry VIII did it, his throne apparently played a little tune. Yes, music, from the throne, by design. Sometime during his reign, in between founding his own church and reorganizing his love life via annulments and executions, Henry commissioned what might be history's most bizarre piece of royal furniture, a mechanical seat that played music whenever he sat down. Think of it as the Tudor version of a musical chair, except no one was laughing. Not openly, anyway. Historians believe this musical throne was an elaborate contraption outfitted with bellows, pipes, and perhaps a hidden wind-up mechanism, likely crafted by court artisans or imported clockmakers. When pressure was applied, say, by a monarch of considerable presence, the mechanism was triggered, releasing a triumphant tune or cheerful fanfare. Was it meant to impress? Intimidate? Amuse? All three, probably. Henry loved spectacle, and few things are more theatrical than entering a room, sitting down, and being immediately serenaded by your own furniture. The throne was reportedly used during private audiences and informal court functions. Rumors swirled that the king had different tunes installed depending on the occasion. A regal trumpet flourish for state matters, perhaps a lighter melody for feasts or celebrations. Naturally, not everyone approved. Conservative courtiers saw it as undignified. Foreign diplomats were baffled, but Henry didn't care. For him, power wasn't just something you held, it was something you performed. And what better way to perform power than by orchestrating your own musical entrance, seated like a king in a one-man opera? The fate of the musical throne is unclear. It vanished from records, likely dismantled or lost in one of the many palace renovations. But its story remains, a curious testament to Henry's flair for merging ego, engineering, and absurdity. And if musical furniture wasn't quite strange enough, just wait, because his descendant, Queen Mary II, spent her free time crafting elaborate seashell scenes and stuffing dead birds, as one does. 47. Queen Mary II collected seashells and stuffed birds. While her husband, King William III, was suspending beds from ceilings and fretting over hidden assassins, Queen Mary II was indulging in a far more tranquil and oddly whimsical hobby, collecting seashells and taxidermied birds. Yes, behind the formal portraits and the stern Protestant reforms was a queen who enjoyed building tiny seaside dioramas, arranging delicate shells into scenes of miniature fantasy. Think Versailles meets a beach vacation in a shoebox. These weren't casual displays either. They were crafted with obsessive attention to detail, combining shells, coral, colored sands, and occasionally bits of semi-precious stone to give her creations sparkle and depth. Her interest in shells wasn't just idle curiosity. It was part of a broader 17th century trend known as curiosity cabinets. Aristocrats across Europe were assembling collections of the strange and beautiful. Fossils, bones, odd stones, beetles, and of course, shells. Mary's collection, however, was more artistic than scientific. She arranged her shells like a painter, carefully balancing color, shape, and texture. Then there were the birds. Queen Mary was known to keep a private collection of stuffed birds, including rare and exotic species sent to her by traders and admirers from across the globe. Some she mounted herself, others were prepared by specialists and displayed in glass domes or wooden cases. To her they were not just curiosities, but symbols of the world she ruled, frozen in time and presented for aesthetic enjoyment. Visitors to her private quarters were often surprised by the contrast. A monarch trained in statecraft and Protestant discipline, surrounded by rooms filled with fragile seashell mosaics and meticulously arranged dead canaries. But this was Mary's refuge, a quiet rebellion against the weight of the crown. In the face of war, reform, and dynastic pressure, she turned to art, nature, and order. Shell by shell, feather by feather. Meanwhile, one of her royal descendants decided that not just his soul, but his heart itself, deserved a separate burial, preferably in a golden box. 48. King Charles II ordered his own heart to be buried separately. King Charles II, the original Mary monarch, knew how to throw a party, charm a mistress, and survive political upheaval. But when it came to death, he took an unusually sentimental route. He wanted his heart removed and buried separately, ideally in a golden box. According to various accounts and royal rumors, Charles had a clear vision for his afterlife logistics. His body, of course, would go to Westminster Abbey, but his heart, the supposed seat of his merriment, regrets, and maybe all that brandy, would be interred on its own, preserved, enshrined, honored. He reportedly requested that it be placed in a golden casket, a symbol not just of royal opulence, but of emotional weight. The request wasn't written into a formal will. This was more of a whispered wish, shared with a few trusted attendants near the end of his life. And whether out of reverence or awkwardness, it was never actually fulfilled. The golden box? Never made. The heart? Buried right along with the rest of him. But the desire itself was strange enough to echo across royal history. Why separate the heart? Some historians argue it was symbolic. Charles II had lived a deeply dual life. Public reveler, private thinker. He'd spent his early years in exile, his middle years in scandal, and his final days in increasingly poor health. Perhaps he saw his heart as a separate entity, burdened with more than the crown could carry. Or maybe he just liked drama. Either way, the legend remains. A king who wanted to be remembered not just in whole, but in pieces. A monarch who believed that even in death, the show must go on, preferably with golden accessories. And if Charles's heart was never truly separated, Queen Elizabeth II more than made up for it, by dividing her affections between dozens of corgis, each with their own birthday cakes and Christmas stockings. 49. Queen Elizabeth II owned more than 30 corgis. For Queen Elizabeth II, the crown was a lifelong duty. But corgis were a lifelong joy. She didn't just own a few royal pups. She raised an empire of them, establishing a dynasty of stubby-legged, sharp-eared companions that became as iconic to her image as the crown itself. Over her 96 years, Elizabeth owned more than 30 corgis. Many of them descended from her first, a puppy named Susan, gifted to her on her 18th birthday in 1944. From Susan came a long line of pampered, privileged pooches, some with tempers more fiery than the Queen's brightest ceremonial hat. These weren't just pets. They were family, complete with their own wing of Buckingham Palace and a rotating staff of handlers, walkers, and chefs. Yes, chefs. The Queen's corgis were treated to specially prepared meals. No kibble for these royal snouts. Dishes were made fresh daily. Beef, chicken, rabbit, served with rice and finely chopped vegetables. And for special occasions, the dogs received birthday cakes made of liver and rice, served on silver trays with candles, unlit mercifully. Each corgi had a Christmas stocking, personally filled by the Queen with toys and treats. They traveled with her, slept in cushioned wicker baskets, accompanied her to photo shoots, and occasionally they misbehaved with the flair of tiny tyrants. Footmen were nipped, royal carpets were claimed. Yet Elizabeth remained devoted, often more forgiving of a corgi's snarl than a prime minister's mistake. Their names, too, were wonderfully British: Willow, Holly, Emma, Candy, Sugar, Whisper. Some were memorialized in paintings, others in royal anecdotes. When one passed, the Queen was reportedly heartbroken, each loss a quiet ripple through the palace. In later years, she chose not to breed more, not wanting to leave any young corgis behind. A rare moment of restraint from a monarch who, in so many ways, was defined by enduring legacy. And speaking of legacy, if Queen Elizabeth's was built on dogs and diplomacy, her ancestor Henry VII placed his faith in something far shinier, a ruby talisman said to ward off the plague itself. 50. King Henry VII. Believed rubies could prevent the plague. Long before hand sanitizer and face masks, King Henry VII had his own idea of disease prevention. Rubies. Specifically, a ruby he wore constantly, close to his body, sometimes around his neck, sometimes sewn discreetly into his clothing, believing it could ward off the plague. It sounds strange now, but in the late 15th century this belief wasn't considered fringe science. It was just science. Rubies, along with other precious stones like sapphires and emeralds, were thought to possess mystical healing properties. But rubies held a special place in the medieval mind. They symbolized vitality, protection, and even divine favor. When polished just right, they were said to glow, proof, to some, that they pulsed with holy energy. For Henry VII, a man who rose to power through bloodshed and carefully maintained control in a deeply unstable realm, the ruby was more than superstition. It was a shield, spiritual and symbolic, against a world he could not fully command. The plague had ravaged Europe for over a century by the time Henry took the throne. Outbreaks still flared with little warning, decimating cities and altering dynasties. Monarchs were not immune. The fear of sudden death loomed large, and so Henry, never a man to leave matters to chance, turned to the shimmering reassurance of his ruby. He had it blessed by priests, wore it during court sessions, kept it near during travels. It became part of his royal armor, seen in portraits, referenced in letters, whispered about in courts abroad. Did it work? Of course not. But Henry survived where many didn't, and that was enough to keep the legend alive. For him, the ruby represented control over the uncontrollable, a token of survival in a time ruled by fate, fear, and unseen forces. Yet while Henry's faith in stones was metaphorical armor, one of his descendants preferred actual dirt and found greater joy in farming than ruling an empire. 51. King George III loved farming more than politics. While most monarchs were busy drafting edicts, planning wars, or pondering divine right, King George III was out in his fields, measuring crop yields and inspecting soil quality. And not as a photo op. He genuinely preferred agriculture to politics. Nicknamed Farmer George, he became somewhat of an agricultural influencer, before that was a term, bringing the Enlightenment's enthusiasm for scientific improvement directly into the royal backyard. While Parliament debated, George plowed. While aristocrats schemed, George cataloged seed varieties. He had model farms built on royal estates, especially at Windsor and Kew, where he experimented with crop rotation, new plow designs, and selective breeding of livestock. He read manuals on land drainage, weather patterns, and animal husbandry. His interest was so intense that foreign diplomats often arrived expecting to discuss treaties, only to be regaled with harvest statistics and lectures on wheat quality. This wasn't eccentricity. It was part of George's broader philosophy, a belief that the monarchy should be moral, industrious, and close to the land. He felt deeply connected to his country, not just as ruler, but as steward of its soil. Of course, his passion for agriculture sometimes clashed with his political duties. He had little patience for corruption or inefficiency, preferring the predictable honesty of a potato field over the House of Commons. Some ministers joked that if Britain could be run like a farm, George would have solved everything with compost and crop calendars. Still, his interest left a legacy. George helped legitimize agricultural science in Britain. He made it fashionable. And in a quiet way, he embodied a humbler version of monarchy, one rooted in the earth, not just elevated by ceremony. Yet for all his pastoral values, his granddaughter would embrace a much stranger routine, having her royal teeth brushed daily by her daughters, mid-command. 52. Queen Victoria had her teeth cleaned by her daughters. There are many ways to define royal duty. Some involve statecraft, diplomacy, and the heavy weight of a crown. Others, apparently, involve a toothbrush and the grim resolve to clean your mother's molars. In the later years of Queen Victoria's life, her daughters were tasked with brushing her teeth, a job as bizarre as it was disturbingly intimate. By the end of her reign, Victoria had grown too frail to manage her own grooming. This was not entirely unexpected. After all, she lived to 81, an impressive age in the 19th century, and suffered from numerous ailments including arthritis, poor vision, and limited mobility. But in true Victorian fashion, no detail of personal routine was too small to become ritualized. and rather than rely on servants for the task of oral hygiene, the queen insisted it be handled by family, that is, her daughters. Why? Perhaps it was a matter of trust. Perhaps she believed that only blood relatives should be allowed such close access, especially when her public image was so carefully controlled. Or maybe, in the deeply repressed and emotionally reserved world of Queen Victoria, this was her most tangible form of maternal bonding. A moment of awkward intimacy in a palace where affection was rarely spoken. Her daughters, particularly Princess Beatrice, her youngest and most devoted, reportedly carried out the duty with dignified stoicism. They would gently scrub her teeth while she sat upright in bed or in her armchair, issuing commands in between instructions. "A bit more on the left," she might murmur, before shifting topics to military reports or dinner menus. Court gossip described the scenes as peculiar and rather clinical. Visitors were quietly ushered out before the brushing commenced. No mint toothpaste or electric brushes, of course, just stiff bristles, chalky pastes, and the steady hands of a royal child expected to serve without question. It was a chore that blurred the lines between filial duty and imperial absurdity, one that no amount of diamonds or titles could glamorize. Historians rarely dwell on these moments. They prefer to focus on Victoria, the Empress of India, the widow in eternal black, the queen who symbolized an era. But behind the myth was a woman with aching joints, a stubborn streak, and the very human need to maintain dental hygiene, one gentle brushstroke at a time. If Victoria saw service as loyalty, her descendant, King Charles III, would take loyalty even further, speaking tenderly to his plants as if they were old friends, and claiming they returned the favor. 53. King Charles III talks to his plants. Before he became King Charles III, he was the Prince of Wales, and he was already famous for his conversations with plants. Yes, actual, out-loud conversations. With leaves, with stems, with geraniums and shrubs and, one assumes, the occasional uncooperative rosebush. Charles once admitted, quite casually, that he talked to his plants every day. Not metaphorically, not in passing. Proper, deliberate conversations. And according to him, the plants responded better when spoken to kindly. This revelation caused a predictable wave of amusement in the press. Tabloids had a field day. Prince of Petunias, the talking tulip whisperer. Comedians mimicked him coaxing tomatoes into ripening with compliments. For many, it became the defining oddity of his public persona. Proof, they said, of his privileged eccentricity. But Charles wasn't joking. In fact, he was slightly ahead of his time. His interest in plant communication was rooted, pun intended, in genuine ecological philosophy. Long before environmentalism became fashionable, he was deeply concerned with sustainability, organic farming, and the relationships between living organisms. Speaking to plants, in his view, was an extension of that empathy, an acknowledgement that nature thrives on respect, not dominance. He elaborated in interviews, explaining that tone mattered. Plants responded to gentle encouragement, not scolding. He wasn't issuing royal decrees to his dahlias, he was holding conversations, listening, in his way, to what the garden had to say. And while it was easy to mock, scientists later confirmed that plants do, in fact, react to sound, light, and even certain frequencies of vibration. So maybe Charles wasn't just being quirky. Maybe he was inadvertently pioneering the next phase of garden therapy. His garden at Highgrove became a kind of green cathedral, manicured, lush, and tended with reverence. Visitors described it as meditative, almost sacred. To Charles, each tree was a relationship, each plant, a personality. His garden wasn't just landscape, it was a conversation partner. And so, in a world of noisy politics and ruthless headlines, Charles chose a quieter kind of diplomacy, one whispered among leaves, nurtured by time, and unbothered by ridicule. Fitting, really, that in a family of conquerors, reformers, and empire builders, one king would find meaning not in dominating the world, but in gently chatting with a fern.